just going to take you through the presentation for this. It's a project information standard. So what this is, it's kind of departing from the templates. The templates originally talked about how you put information requirements together, and part of them information requirements require project information standards. And I suppose really the most common one that people know about or are interested in is about file naming. So I suppose just to talk about GDA again, the mission for GDA is to unite the construction industry and built environment stakeholders towards interoperable data to improve efficiency and international competitivity on a sustainable basis in Ireland. So in a way, really, what I'm going to present as what we've prepared as our project information standard is a sheet. And it basically, it looks like a drawing register, or document register, I should say. But there's really a lot more to this sheet than just a document register. And there's a lot of concepts, and there's some functionality within the sheet that are actually very, very useful. And I suppose the first concept around this, and I think one of the most important concepts around this, is that as a client, you're probably familiar with the idea of an information dump or data drop. And in a way, really, as a client, that's not what we should be looking for. We should be looking for planned exchanges of information. And the idea that at the end of the stage, we get a transfer of multiple files, of file names, and it's just passed over to you in your common data environment is not the way you should be operating. It should be more that you look at what you need. And this is also included within the ISO standards around information delivery planning. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on when I show the template. But really, when at the start of each stage, I suppose where I'd look at that in the capital works management framework, your team should know what they're delivering at the end of the stage. And that's not very popular. Usually I've found that there's a lot of pushback to say, oh, we won't know what we're producing. And really, if they don't know what they're producing is, they haven't planned for what they're producing. And they really should be. It should be part of their task information delivery plan that will form into part of the master information delivery plan. And they should have a reasonably mature idea of what will come at the end. Now, there might be a little bit of variation, but you should know 80% of what they'll deliver at the end of the stage, at the start of the stage. They know what's the requirements of the stage, they know what they need. So they should be doing the document register, the issue sheet, at the start of the stage and not after the drawings are produced. And that should be also a tool for within the information authors during the stage to know what they need to name their files or name the containers to be transferred at the end of the stage. So I think that's a really important idea, that it's not a case of we wait to the end of the stage and information is passed, that it's more proactive than that. And look, I suppose this is not new. I suppose this is one of an early company that I worked for, and an issue sheet, you wouldn't dream of sending over back in the day, paper prints, 6 copies usually or whatever, without including an issue sheet in what you get. So it was always very important that issue sheets was a practice that was there, that was a good practice that seems to be kind of lost at the moment, that really you kind of get what you're given at the end of the stage, and you need to convert and look at that differently. I suppose now to go into actually the mechanics of the naming itself, and I suppose really standardized naming, and really there's a lot of value in standardized naming. It allows people to find the right information quickly. It allows facilitates people to work over multiple projects. So like if there's a naming convention within an organization, it means that all the projects that's done within that naming convention is standardized, it's the same. Now, I suppose one of the biggest changes that people have and organizations have is that within naming conventions, usually it was a design teams or construction team, they used their own naming convention. That has changed now, that the naming convention is by the client and by the project, and it means that's the naming convention that must be used. So it's important that that's the client's naming convention that's used across the projects. Makes information more reusable, and I suppose that's pretty obvious. If you can find it easily, you can use it again, and it makes it just that's the idea of that. You can also rapidly search and filter and file and organize information when you have a standard filing naming convention, and also it allows computers to actually automatically file and use information as well if you have a standard naming convention. I suppose then to just go on and look at what the container identifiers according to ISO 19650. Now, within the standard itself, it's very, there's only a few things it asks for. It asks for a unique ID based on an agreed a project agreed convention delimited by slashes. That's really basically all it says about the naming convention for the file name, and it does prescribe the metadata. The attributes should be suitability, status, revision, and classification. So classification is actually mandatory according to ISO 19650 on the metadata. So and that's all that's required. It shall contain, it shall enable, and that's what the file naming for the standard does. But what has happened is there's been two national annexes, and I suppose really I want to kind of have a quick look at the English national annex as well, or the British national annex and the Irish national annex, because these will be the ones that people are familiar with, and to look at, compare and contrast a little bit and see where they are, what's the difference between them, and even see what the similarity is between them as well. So you can see that through the comparison that there is a good few areas that's similar to some areas in different locations, but they are aligned. But the noticeable difference is some of the words are actually different for discipline and project role, and I think they slightly mean a different thing, and form and information type slightly mean a different thing. So there is some differences there, but in general there is a lot of commonality then as well. So I suppose really, I think the thing about looking at a naming convention is to go back to basics and what you actually need in a naming convention. You need to understand the location, the subject, a unique ID for it, the purpose of that information, the form of that information, and the status of that information and the version of that information. In basics, that's the information the metadata that you need in its most stripped down format. And I suppose you have that within the Irish naming convention. It talks about project, it talks about, so the project, sub-project phase, and spatial zone and level talk about location. The system talks about the subject of the documents. Information type talks about the information type, and then the project project role also talks about the type of information, and the number is unique identifier, and then the other things are covered in the metadata. The version, the suitability is then covered in the metadata. So it kind of covers what you're needing there on it. So then to move around and say, well, look, what about when you don't use it? And I suppose this is one of the biggest problems that I used to experience when I was working, was that what you had was the file name was dependent on the folder structure within the file. And that meant that you might have a file at the end of it called first floor. And to look at that file outside of the filing structure just makes no sense. So it was to do with that, it was an as-built, it was a mechanical contractor, low temperature, hot water, drawing, and then you get first floor. So you need the metadata, so to speak, was actually the folders names, which wasn't really attached to the file. So I suppose to just look at that, of how that might look. So in a way, really, the string of information there along that, it can be quite long. And I know that's one thing that people talk about is within the file namings, they are quite long. But really what you can do is you can get rid of the folder structure from that file. Now there is a small folder structure that I'll explain where I've came up with that folder structure and why I use it. But really, all the information you need to know about that file is in the name. You don't need a folder structure, and that's what people need to do. I know there's always an argument saying that we run out of characters. The reason why you run out of characters is the amount of folders you use before you actually put the file name in. But realistically speaking, within your common data environment system, you should be looking at short name folders, and you should be looking at limited amount of folders because you don't really need them. That information is there in the file name. So then to go back and talk about the revisions, and I know one thing is I had some discussions with people, and WPW produced this and allowed me to use this in presentation, and I think it's actually quite of a good thing to look at, and a good way of looking at the metadata to do with the suitability of the purpose codes against the Capital Works Management Framework. And there is a little bit more thought that we probably need to put into this, and a little bit more guidance that we need to put in it, because like if you look at PO1 and PO2, they don't really align perfectly with it, or the definitions behind them. As you go down into the P3 to P10, it's not that bad. It actually aligns much better. But I suppose maybe watch this space. Will probably come out with some more guidance on what we need to do to make sure to make them purpose codes align with the Capital Works Management Framework, which we need to work with. And I suppose now just to talk about the actual support itself. So if you go onto the Build Digital website, in the Exchange Hub, under the templates, there's a template that I'll go in and show you now in a couple of minutes. So I suppose really what Build Digital want to do is want to make some recommendations about it. And it's always stop and think. It's like, why are you doing this? What is the purpose behind it? Is it adding value? And all them questions must be added. Adding value is a very important question for what you do. If you're going to fill in your metadata within your common data environment, what is that workflow adding value? So you just don't need to question that. And I suppose it's planned for what documents you need. So it's about that at the start of the stage that you actually look at and say, well, what are we going to need at the end of it? And then we can work out how that's done. Make all project actors work to the project standard naming convention. Now that's very important, because you'll always have people like one thing I will say is, like, I suppose the pushback you'll have is, as a client, and you have multiple projects and you'll have multiple different design teams on that project, and as that client, you want to have a common naming convention over all your projects, no matter what project it is. Who actually produces it. But that can be difficult for your supply chain, because your supply chain might be working on multiple projects for different clients, which might be asking them to do a slightly different naming convention. And I suppose that's one thing about the Irish Annex and the BIM mandate, I suppose, as well. The BIM mandate has mandated that public clients must use the Annex. And that will mean that most of the project naming will be more or less aligned, will be largely in line. And like that's a very strong thing. Like if there's small issues within the annex, that will be ironed out over feedback in the next revision. But to have a large client like the government using the same very similar naming convention will really help them small to medium enterprises that's working across multiple ones. And this is an important one as well, is divide your documents into elements. One of the things that I seen was that you'll get a safety file and it'll be a single PDF, and within that PDF you'd have everything. You'd have your manuals, you'd have your drawings, you'd have your specs, you'd have your operationals, you'd have everything. And it was just one document, and that was very difficult to search. And also, as well as that, was very difficult to approve it as well, because sometimes what you were having was people were putting in full brochures from companies, not just the actual product data sheet that you needed. So split them out into the elements you want. So a product data sheet for each element of your product data sheet. I'm happy with having that a single file. So it's one data sheet for one pump or whatever, one single PDF of a single page or or a few pages, or maybe even you might be able to gather the stuff around a pump to say that you put your manual, your data sheets, and maybe your warranties in a merged PDF around one item. So just look at how you're going to arrange your documentation when it comes to handover. You think always human readable, because really that's the thing, is make sure that you have stuff that's human readable and you don't go too far down the codification. And I don't think that's really a good approach. And understand your workflow through your CDE technical solutions from your asset information life cycle. And that's important. So basically what you need to do is you need to understand that you're going to have a handover and you're going to have an operational phase. There's no point in collecting and organizing your information in design and construction that's not going to be suitable for operations. Or when it changes CDE, think about your metadata. How is that metadata being transferred? And what's going on with that? So I suppose really you need to consider them things, and you don't get into a kind of a situation that you've actually managed a whole heap of metadata all during the project, but then when it's handed over to your asset, to the operations, that metadata is then lost. And I suppose the project code, the metadata of the classification is that really important one that I think should be looked after. And this is also something that you should think of is a proof of concept on a previous project. So I suppose I've always hear about organizations going into pilot projects, and I kind of worry about the idea of a pilot project, because in a way really trying to understand and work through and change of your naming convention on a live project is a very risky thing to be doing. And I always would recommend, when you're doing a naming convention, it's very simple to just pick the last project you completed, get the issue sheet if you from that project, or if not, make an issue sheet of everything that was delivered and the naming that was delivered in, and then just convert it on that Excel sheet to your new naming convention. So then what you do is you test out what will come down the road, how things will work, what way it'll do. It's a much better way to do it than saying, okay, well, we're going to adopt the Irish Annex. So the next project we do, it's going to be to the Irish Annex. Is that okay with everybody in the design team? That is just such a risky way of doing it. And I would even say that when you're doing pilot projects, what you should do is break up your project and not. It's a very brave idea to go and say your next project is going to be according to ISO 19650. There's probably elements that you can say within the next project, what we're going to do is we're going to specify all the project information standards that we need for that project. Get that done, get that work done, and do elements as you do. So it's always think about that when you're doing pilot projects, that you're not biting off more than you can chew and bringing in risk that way. So I suppose just to thank our sponsors of Build Digital as well.